Welcome to part 2 of our Chernobyl saga. You may wonder what it is in my hands. It is AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifle. Believe it or not, it was really used here in the bowels of the melted reactor 4. And this is neither fiction nor video game. This is the truth about Chernobyl, a history written in graphite part 2. If you want to know more, stay with us, but now we must find shelter. It took a few months to build a sarcophagus, a concrete, lead and steel quick fix that was to keep radioactive dust and radioactivity from spreading into the atmosphere. The problem with quick fix is that it doesn't last long, and the sarcophagus was the proof of that. It had so many big holes that birds nested there. Well, it wasn't designed to last forever, and its terrible shape manifested in 2013, when a piece of roof collapsed, releasing radioactivity and causing temporary evacuation of the area. It took exactly 30 years, without 1 month, from building the sarcophagus in December 1986 to covering it with new proper construction called New Safe Confinement, New Shelter, in November of 2016. But even then, it was under further construction until July 2019, when finally the journalists were allowed there. The new shelter's construction began in 2010. It is a large arch-shaped dome made of steel and powered by solar panels. It is about 110 meters high, that's 360 feet high. It allows to safely take apart the old sarcophagus and the reactor's debris without risking further contamination. The new safe confinement cost 1.5 billion euro, a currency that itself is quite fascinating. That is more than $1.6 billion, but the whole shelter implementation plan costs 2.1 billion euro, that is $2.3 billion. Yes, the power plant after the meltdown stayed operational with its remaining 3 RMBK reactors. They shut down the reactor 2 in 1981, reactor 1 in 1996, and finally reactor number 3 in December of 2000. This was possible thanks to an agreement between European Union and Ukraine. Basically meaning they close Chernobyl power plant if EU gives them money for improving energy sector in the country and assists in the building of a new shelter. So, Soviets polluted nearly the whole Europe on both sides of the Iron Curtain without telling anyone, and in the end, Europe paid for it. Forget Wall Street. Do business Soviet style. Do the mess disappear and make others pay for it. The whole cleanup of this cursed place is scheduled for 2065, nearly a century after they built it. While the sarcophagus was being built over the reactor 4, the scientists had to remove fuel rods remaining there to avoid any risks of possible explosion. They risked their lives doing it in the heat from the core and received huge doses of radiation. Finally, in December of 1986, using a remote-operated camera, they discovered a very radioactive mass, more than 2 meters wide, that is 6.5 feet wide, in the basement of Unit 4, which they named and elephant's foot due to its appearance. It is composed of nuclear fuel that leaked from the reactor, sand and concrete. You remember corium lava-like material? An unknown crystalline form inside of it was discovered. Chernobylite. Soviets wouldn't have been Soviets if they hadn't tried to shoot the elephant's foot with Kalashnikov, using armor-piercing rounds, since the foot was harder than a drill bit used to collect its sample. One could say that they shot themselves in the foot, literally. Officially, AK-47 became a scientific tool for sample collection. It is estimated that about 95% of reactors' force fuel from the time of the accident, about 200 tons, remains inside the new shelter. The radioactive material consists of core fragments, dust and corium. It is going to take a lot of AK-47 rounds to remove it. It took only 3 weeks of July 1987 to sentence 6 key persons involved in the disaster of the Chernobyl power plant. The deputy chief engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, guilty of criminal mismanagement of potentially explosive enterprises, was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. The plant director Viktor Brukyanov and the chief engineer Nikolai Fomin also got 10 years. None of them served full sentence. Those names you may know from movies, TV series. They were the most presented in press and mass media. Other 3 responsible persons received less strict sentences, from 2 to 5 years. The chief director of Reactor 4, Boris Rogozhin, the chief of Reactor 4, Alexander Kovalenko, USSR State Committee on Supervision of Safe Conduct of Work in Atomic Energy, Inspector Yuri Loshkin. To give this trial a sense of populist payback rather than fairness, the trial took place in the House of Culture of Chernobyl City. And since Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptunov had already died, their prosecution was terminated. The human factor is still considered the main cause for the accident, since the crew of the Reactor 4 didn't follow the plant test program in order to execute the test faster. They lacked knowledge, experience, and understanding of the nuclear device they were operating. They switched off many essential security systems, not to mention pulling way too many of "do not touch" security control rods. Despite the fact that human factor played a crucial role in the disaster, it was not solely the operating staff that was to blame. But in the USSR, it was impossible to blame the design of RMBK reactor for the meltdown. Moreover, Ukraine declassified some KGB documents from the period of the building and catastrophe of the Chernobyl plant, showing the awareness and indifference of the Soviets about the negligence during the construction of the plant, such as splitting of concrete layers. To quickly refresh your memory from part 1, the main fault were graphite-tipped control rods in the reactor, causing a rapid increase in nuclear power just before hampering it. The accelerate before break phenomenon. It caused instability of the reactor because too many control rods were extracted. Water was boiling, inducing more chain reaction, and when the power instantly started to raise, the scrum button was pressed to switch off the reactor, but it added even more power. The graphite-tipped control rods, the accelerate before break phenomenon, and boom! Well, when people are absent, nature takes over the cities. But what happened in the place of one of the only two most devastating nuclear disasters in history of mankind? At the time of the meltdown, due to immense radiation, a pine forest near the Chernobyl power plant turned red and died. It is the infamous red forest or rusted forest. This place has one of the highest nuclear contamination in the world. At first, it was bulldozed and wood was buried in the trenches. Some pines grew back, but those buried are now a threat to the groundwaters. Different plants cope differently with the radiation. Birch trees, for example, survive the radiation. The soil still emits high radioactivity. In general, the problem with flora like grass or trees, bushes or etc. in contaminated areas is plants' life cycle. Plants draw water, minerals along with radionuclides from the ground, and when plants lose leaves and produce fruits, this brings radiation back onto the surface again. As we know, plants are eaten by animals. During and after the fallout, some animals in the worst affected areas died or stopped reproducing. For example, some cattle that survived, especially calves, never grew to full mature size because their thyroid was damaged. It is reported that many Ukrainian farms registered mutated animals like extra or missing limbs, deformed skulls, missing eyes or ribs. Time passed. Radiation dropped due to radioactive decay, although radiation levels in the 30 kilometer, that is 19 miles exclusion zone surrounding Chernobyl are still 10 to 100 times higher than normal background radiation. However, in 2007, Ukraine designated the exclusion zone as a wildlife sanctuary, which is one of the largest wildlife sanctuaries in Europe. Existing animal populations have multiplied. Some species absent for centuries returned or have been reintroduced. For example, very rare and native Eurasian lynx, grey wolf, Eurasian brown bear, wild boar, black stork, and introduced at the end of the 20th century, Przewalski's horse. On the other hand, invertebrate populations like bumblebees, butterflies, grasshoppers, or spiders significantly dropped. It is because those creatures lay eggs or nest on or in the top layer of soil that, due to cesium-137, is most radioactive. There are also mushrooms, fungi, and those also absorb radiation. But here's the thing about them. Inside reactor 4, there was discovered radiotropic fungus, melanized black fungus that absorbs radiation and converts it into chemical energy for its growth. These black fungi grow a lot better if exposed to radiation compared to other non-melanized fungi. We know rats are tough and will survive mostly anything, so we leave them alone. Birds are also resilient enough, as I already told you, to nest inside old cracked sarcophagus, but they, allegedly, in comparison to the normal counterparts, had smaller brains due to high radiation. There are also some plants that manage to adapt to the increased radiation levels. One of them is native to Chernobyl, Arabidopsis. It was the first plant to produce its seed in space in 1982, brought there by, who else? Soviets. But also, it resists radiation and doesn't mutate in its native contaminated Chernobyl habitat. A very tough plant. Water life was also affected. Most of lakes and reservoirs are still highly contaminated and pose great threat due to spring floods when Thawing snow fills them with water, and that water flows later to two main rivers. Fish living in those radioactive waters seem to do well, and thanks to tourists, even very well. That is for Chernobyl, but in other countries, some things also change due to the fallout. For example, in some parts of the United Kingdom, until 2012, sheep movement was restricted and regulated by law because those animals eat grass that grows on radiation-absorbing peat. Every year during dry season, between April and October, radiation poses a threat to Europe because of fires that bring radioactive elements from the ground to the atmosphere. On the 4th of April 2020, 20 hectares, 50 acres, burned. In the very first days of the Chernobyl disaster, people close to reactor 4 suffered from acute radiation syndrome, ARS, vomiting, headaches, and sometimes skin reddening. The thing is, the faster you see the symptoms, the less chances of surviving you have. It is called a latent phase. In high doses of radiation, also your DNA goes to shreds. ARS is noticeable by a drop in the number of blood cells called aplastic anemia, which causes bad wound healing that increased mortality. Very high doses of radiation cause neurological symptoms like decreased level or a lack of consciousness, which in most cases is fatal. Radiation cancer may occur after a latent period of 20 to 40 years even. Officially, the total number of mortal victims in Chernobyl disaster is 31 people. More than 130 people suffered from the acute radiation syndrome. 28 of them died within 3 months. The death from the accident involved only workers in the reactor plant and firefighters. Many of those who survived suffered radiation-induced cataracts and radiation burns. Their dusty uniforms caused beta burns on large areas of skin. Well, the issue of long-term effects of the disaster, especially concerning deaths or mutation in humans, is still controversial and estimations vary depending on who does them, since no one wants to take too much responsibility. However, the research shows abnormal increase in thyroid cancer, especially among children exposed to radiation due to iodine-131, either by air or by drinking contaminated milk. 6,000 children were reported to have suffered from thyroid cancer, and by 2005, 15 of them died from it. The thing with estimated long-term outcome in death worldwide is, some say the number in thyroid cancer was always high, but we know about it just now because of the widespread screening programs launched after the disaster. The International Journal of Cancer in 2006 states, models predict that by 2065, about 16,000 cases of thyroid cancer and 25,000 cases of other cancers may be expected due to radiation from the accident, whereas several 100 million cancer cases are expected from other causes. On the other hand, according to the Union Chernobyl, which is the main organization of liquidators, 60,000 of liquidators are now dead and 165,000 disabled. A 7-fold increase in DNA mutations has been identified in children of liquidators conceived after the accident. But the World Health Organization states children conceived before or after their father's exposure show no statistically significant differences in mutation frequencies. Well, in my opinion, it is as they say, I pay, I demand results. It took 4 years from the disaster for the most secretive empire in the world to collapse. We may never find the truth. Chernobyl disaster released several hundred more radiation than A-bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but only 100th to 1000th of the radioactivity released during nuclear weapon testing between 1950s and 1960s. As of 2016, in the zone, the radiation exposure from the radionuclides has dropped by half since 1986. Cesium-137, along with isotopes of strontium, are the two main nuclides that prevent the Chernobyl exclusion zone from repopulation. There are the following hazards. Cesium tends to accumulate in vital organs such as heart, and strontium accumulates in bones, and thus be a risk of causing leukemia. The reactor itself doesn't pose a threat anymore. The year hadn't passed after the disaster when 75% of the land was back under cultivation. Despite that, only a third of the evacuated villages were resettled. Today, in a small Chernobyl zone, there lives about 150 Samosioli. It means self-settlers. Those are the people who returned or even settled despite not living there before. Their number is in constant decline. Most of them are senior resident women with an average age of 63. They live in Chernobyl itself as well as in close villages. In 2012, Ukraine informally permitted the elderly Samosioli to stay in the area, but all the younger inhabitants were to move out. After the disaster of 1986, there have been about 1,000 deaths of 1,200 people and just one birth in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. The only known birth happened on 25th of August 1999, when a 46-year-old woman gave birth to a healthy girl called Maria. Maria's parents, Lydia Sovenko and Mikhail Bedernikov, had come to Chernobyl a few months earlier. Maria lived in Chernobyl until 2006. Now, she lives outside the zone, but her parents stayed there. Pripyat remains uninhabitable due to constant high radiation and extremely radioactive spots covering this area. To this day, deadly radioactive clothing of firefighters and medics can be found on hospital corridors. Chernobyl city, that lays outside the exclusion zone, was evacuated but now is repopulated with workers of the power plant. There is about 3,000 or maybe more workers who monitor radiation, control forest fires. They, of course, do not live inside the zone, but work shifts there. Some of the workers work 4 days on, 3 off. Others work in 15 days on, 15 days off routine. Plant personnel live mainly in Slavutich, a specially built remote city 45 kilometers, that is 28 miles east of the reactor. Everyone employed in the zone is monitored for radiation. Chernobyl has a cafe, a hotel and a bus station. Nice. Since 2007, games like Stalker or Call of Duty have been presenting Chernobyl zone as a fantastic place to visit, a Soviet city of Pripyat stopped in time where unimaginable things would happen. Ukrainian government literally cashed on that promotion. In 2011, Chernobyl zone was officially open to tourists, and this fatal attraction branch of Ukraine economy grows with each year. There are daily or multiple day tours from Kiev. One would stay overnight in the zone and listen to the sounds of the mutants. Of course, it would be a hotel, And instead of mutants, you'd have to listen to your tour guide so you wouldn't enter some irradiated place and harm yourself. And your radiation level would be monitored. One thing that everyone notices when visiting Chernobyl zone is the fact that there are no children there. If you are underage, you probably will not enter the zone even with parents. Personally, I do not need to visit Chernobyl since it visited me in 1986, right?
Down in that tread, we are off scale, and that would be 80 milliroentgens per hour, so we're probably in the vicinity of 100.
All that metal, army equipment, ships, trucks, cars and car parts, furniture, everyday things left in abandoned homes, all that seems like an easy money for some criminal individuals who, disregarding human life, plunder the zone even though it is guarded by the police. It is proved that many tons of illegally obtained radioactive metal from Chernobyl zone sold to oblivious recycling centers circulate around the world and can be found even in China's foundries. Car parts sold on market in Kiev emit heavy radiation on their new unaware owners, bringing on them the risk of radiation-induced health problems. Not to mention disappearing toilet seats, liquidators' overalls, or instances of poaching that significantly decrease the population of the mentioned Przewalski's horse. That, my dear stalkers, is the end of the part 2 of our Chernobyl roadside picnic. Now you know nearly everything about this wretched yet charming place. Thank you very much for your attention and subscribe to us so you will not miss other weird places we will take you to. I bet you are still thinking about those missing toilet seats. Me too.